Our last three lectures have examined famous Romans within the context of the intellectual achievement of the 2nd century A.D. Epictetus, the Stoic thinker and teacher; Apuleius, the author of the Golden Ass, that allegory of the fate of the human soul and the destiny of every man and woman; and the biographers and historians, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus. Our fourth figure in this part of the lectures, and our final famous Roman, is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is both an intellectual and a man of action. He represents what Plato once dreamt of, the philosopher king. Plato believed that human affairs would never be solved until a philosopher sat upon the throne. He himself made trips to Sicily to try to educate such a philosopher king. The trips were failures. But with Marcus Aurelius, a man of deep learning, of profound morality, well educated not only in ideas, but in the necessities of imperial rule, became emperor. And his reign marks the beginning of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius was from a distinguished Roman family. His father and grandfather, Annius Verus both, represented the best sort of Roman aristocrat. And Marcus came very early to the attention of Hadrian, when Hadrian was emperor. Marcus's father died early on. He was raised for a while by his grandfather, and then he was taken into the court by Hadrian. And Hadrian called the little fellow Verissimus, the most truthful one. For from his earliest days, Marcus Aurelius spoke the truth, and his integrity of character shone forth amidst all the intrigues and corruption of the court. It had been the wish of Hadrian that Marcus follow him as emperor, but Marcus was still too young. And so he saw to it that his own chosen successor, Antoninus, adopted Marcus and raised up Marcus as his own son after Hadrian had died. And Marcus, from his earliest days, loved to study. That is, in fact, what he wanted to do, was to spend his life in study. And he was taken by the Stoic thought, by the ideas of duty, by the love of God. And he had a deep religious side to him, believed that God was all-powerful and all-loving, and that it was your duty and your way to freedom to accept whatever God gave you. Remember when we talked about Epictetus? Evil does not happen in the world. God does not make anything evil. We may not understand why something happens, but we must take it as the will of God. And God had chosen Marcus Aurelius not for a life of contemplation, but to be emperor. He had placed him there, and it was Marcus's duty to prepare himself as well as possible. And so from the beginning of the reign of Antoninus Pius, from 138 onward, down until 161, Marcus played an ever-increasing role in government. Antoninus was emperor at the very height of imperial power. The empire was majestic, it was at peace, it was prosperous, and it is precisely at such a time of seeming prosperity that the empire needed a man of foresight and vision, a man to recognize what the potential problems were. And Antoninus was not just not that kind of man. He was capable, he was a good administrator, he was a morally upright man. But he did not look into the problems that were in potential, that the economy of the empire needed revitalization, that the barbarians along the frontiers, both the Iranians as well as the Germans, were a constant danger, and that the solution of Hadrian, building that wall and those frontier fortifications, was a short-term solution with long-term difficulties built into it. No, instead, Antoninus never stirred from Italy, was content to administer this empire, share its burdens with Marcus Aurelius. And the flood then would break when Marcus became emperor in 161. The economy was in such disrepair that Marcus at one point had to auction off the imperial jewels in order to provide grain distributions for the Roman people. Now that should never have been in an empire which a generation before had brought back 5 million pounds of gold from Dacia. Marcus shared power. He did not have to share it. It was not the intention of Antoninus that his other adopted son become emperor. But what would you do with the other son of Antoninus? And so Marcus made Lucius Verus, his brother by adoption, co-emperor. Verus was not a bad man, but he was lazy. He was basically incompetent, and Marcus entrusted to him the war against the Parthians. Now, this war against the Parthians was the chance to carry out the task of Trajan and conquer and annex forever Iran. Lucius squandered his time, made a completely unsatisfactory peace with the Parthians, and not only came home, but his army brought with him a plague, which swept over the empire, perhaps ultimately costing the lives of 1 out of every 4 Romans. A devastating impact upon manpower, in which human labor played for the Romans the same role that oil plays for us. Human labor was what made their economy work. And now this labor supply was drastically reduced. And then the barbarians, all along the Danube, forming into new, vigorous confederations, massive in number, skilled in fighting the Romans, began to attempt to raid the territory of the empire. And Marcus will spend year after year there along the boundaries of the empire, fighting back the barbarians, fighting this seemingly endless sea of fierce warriors, the Marcomanni, the Quadii, the Sarmatians. And there, along the misty Danube, spending much time in the camp that will one day become the city of Vienna, Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations. In Greek they are called eis auton, for he wrote them naturally in Greek as a philosophical work. To myself, eis auton. Just writings to myself, thoughts that I have. That work would come down to us as one of the noblest treatises on spiritual contemplation ever composed, written by a man of power who every day must deal with all the malice and intrigue that is part of a court, who must lead his armies out in violent struggles against savage barbarians, in which his troops will cut off the heads of the enemy and bring them to him, and in which no quarter can be asked or given. He is never well. He suffers from stomach problems, from ulcers. He has, as a youth, studied so hard that he has broken his health, dining on the simplest of food, frequently sleeping as he prefers, not in a bed, but on the floor, sharing all the trials of his soldiers. The work begins, the Meditations, his eis auton to himself, begins with a summary of what he has learned from his parents, his teachers, and from God. What a noble way to begin a work. I learned from my grandfather, he says, I learned to be courteous and to have a serene temper. Oh, how modest that sounds to us, courtesy. But it is the very essence of a good man, to treat others as you would wish to be treated. And how easy is it for an emperor to brush people off. I am too busy for this. He said, that's another thing I learned. Not to tell people I am too busy, but to always have time for those who come to me. Courtesy and a serene mind. Marcus Aurelius writes to himself, somebody is going to irritate you today. Don't let them. How easy it is to be irritated, isn't that true? Epictetus said the same thing. You want to go take a bath? Then put yourself in the frame of mind that somebody is going to jostle you, the water is going to be dirty, and it is going to irritate you. So you ask yourself, do I want a serene mind or do I want to take a bath? Well, I really want to take a bath, so I will put aside all those things that irritate me. And that is what Marcus Aurelius says. This is practical learning. Shouldn't you put that into practice? I'm going to drive to the grocery store today. Somebody is going to cut in front of me, drive me off the road almost. That is going to irritate me. They're going to make a bad sign at me. They're going to beep their horn at me. Do not let it. In other words, master yourself. How can you be master of the world if you are not master of yourself? So from my grandfather, I learnt courtesy and a serene mind. From my father, both what I remember of him and what I have heard, I learned manliness without ostentation. It's not the word we would use today, but it means courage. I learned to be courageous. I learned to stand up for what is right and to say what is right. Because an emperor is not master of everything. An emperor is bound by all kinds of traditions and party intrigues. But to be courageous and do the right thing, but not make a show of it. And thus set a model that the right thing is what we always do at the court of the emperor. So to be courageous without a lot of show. And from my grandmother, I learned to be pious towards the gods, generous towards others, and simple in my taste. To believe in the gods. Remember what Tacitus told us about learning these virtues from your family? That is the real meaning of family values. It's not a catchword, an advertising phrase, a political slogan. It is reality. And from my teachers. And he lists his teachers. He lists also Epictetus, whom I never knew, but whose works shaped my life, says Marcus Aurelius. From these teachers, I learned to know what is important, to spend my time on what is important, not on learning all the details of geometry, not on learning the facts of history, but on spending my time on moral study, on applying ethics to what I do in life. That is what they showed me. I admire Epictetus. Epictetus said, do not be proud if, as a teacher, you can explain Homer to a class. If Homer were not so obscure, you shouldn't need to explain it. And to take such pride is to turn yourself from a searcher after the truth into a grammarian, or we might say today an academic, who takes pride in explaining obscure things. No. As Epictetus tells us, and Marcus Aurelius affirms, there are 3 steps to knowledge. We learn this in college. First of all, we learn do not lie. Then from that we learn how to show we should not lie, how to prove we should not lie. And then our next step our teacher takes us through is to prove that that is a proof. He gives us the proposition, do not lie. Then we learn how to show logically, philosophically, we should not lie, and then to show logically why that is a proof. The last 2 steps are nonsense. Why spend your time with it? Just do not lie. And that is what my teachers taught me, and forever I am grateful to them. And then, what do I owe to God? I owe His love for me and His coming to me in visions to say, you are on the path of duty. Follow it. How many times I have just wanted to step back, to renounce my power. But God comes to me and says, I have put you in this place. Follow the way. And as we read the thoughts Marcus has for himself, we find his ethics summarized very briefly. Good mind, good thoughts, good deeds. Keep your mind serene and focused on what is important. You are an emperor. What does that mean? How many emperors have there been before? There's been Caesar and Augustus. How many people even really remember them? And in the centuries to come, they will be forgotten. What about great Scipio? He is barely a memory today. So do not be puffed up because you are an emperor. Do not look for your place in history and wonder what your legacy is going to be. Your legacy is nothing. You will be swept away. And do not become prideful if you kill a Sarmatian. What does that mean? You have hunted down a man just as you would hunt down a beast and slaughtered them. Do you think there is glory in that? There would be glory if you could find a way to make peace with them. But God has not chosen that, and so accept it. Don't sit around and whine and complain that you have to fight the Sarmatians. It is not evil. God would not make anything that is evil. It is just your duty. So keep that serenity. And remember, you are no more free than any slave. That slave can be free in himself, and you, if you allow yourself to be caught up with the question of your reputation and your power, you are a slave. So keep your mind pure and serene. Keep your thoughts pure and serene. And good deeds, I can give it to you in one line, says Marcus Aurelius. Love God and love your neighbor. Who would say that? Jesus, would he not? That is the simplest of the commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. Treat everyone as you would wish to be treated. And understand that your time on earth is short. You are, in fact, like an actor in a play. And that is how Marcus ends his writings to himself. God is the playwright. And do not complain if after 3 acts he writes you out of the play. I want to stay on for 5 acts. No, the playwright has given you 3 acts. Depart and be gracious about your departure, even as God is gracious to you. Well, it's a noble work. It can inspire us in our day-to-day activities. But we ask ourselves the question, would Julius Caesar have written these meditations? Would Augustus have written them? And the answer, of course, is no. Noble as they are not the kind of mind you want in imperial power during a critical moment, which calls for resolute action, for a keen sense of the use of power, and for a belief that what you are doing is important and enduring. Marcus Aurelius lacked that will to power that we see in our greatest Romans and Greeks. He was not strong enough for the task. He was too weak with his brother, Lucius Verus. Lucius Verus, what to do with him when Marcus became emperor? Kill him. Oh, don't do it outright, but poison him. Absolute power cannot be shared. And what to do with his wife? She was constantly unfaithful to him. She made him, the people loved Marcus, but nonetheless this lost him respect. He could have had her quietly put out of the way, but he was too weak even to kill his wife. And then she probably conceived a son not by Marcus, but by a gladiator. Such was the report at Rome. And this son was Commodus. Now, reports from Commodus's teachers to Marcus Aurelius showed how vicious the lad was. He had a sadistic spot to himself. He was cruel and manipulative, and all he cared about was gladiatorial games. Now, one of the most important things that Epictetus teaches us, and Marcus Aurelius says, do not give your time up to worthless pursuits. It is beneath your dignity to talk about gladiatorial games. If you have, for some reason, to go, sit there, take as little notice as possible. Do not speak about the games. Do not cheer while they are going on. And when you leave, bring the conversation back to more noble topics. But all Commodus wanted to talk about was these games. And he dreamt, Commodus did, of being a gladiator, of going out into the arena. Well, you might picture someone dreaming of being an NFL quarterback, mightn't you? And for Commodus, this was glory and gain. Now, he was given the best teachers. They had no impact. He was taken with his father on campaign. He was a very unwilling pupil. Oh, Dad, his eyes would glaze over. Would you please stop talking about a serene mind? You know what I'd like to do when I am emperor? This is what he did do. I would love to have a 365 concubines, one for every day out of the year. Where did you get an idea like that? Well, I read that this was what was true of the Persian king. You see, I do get some learning from the things I study in school. Son, don't you understand that your body must be controlled? Why? Prove it to me, Father. You have all this power. Use it. Use it for your enjoyment. The end of life is happiness. And that's not a serene mind. It's just having everything you can get your hands upon. Don't you think Commodus would be at home today? Why do you want to be emperor, son? Well, so I can be emperor. Don't you want to do good things? No. Now, I am not advocating this, of course. It is just from a historical point of view. The Roman Empire would have been better off if Marcus had rid himself of his wife, and he certainly should have rid himself of his son. He thought about it, but he said, I am like Jupiter when he was told that Mars was vicious and would bring trouble into the world. I would have killed him long ago, but he is my son, and I love him. I will leave him with good advisors, and they can make him do right. And so Marcus, 180, died still on campaign, died in the city that would become Vienna, along the banks of the Danube. And Commodus, with him on campaign, succeeded to the imperial power. Now with this, the tradition going back to Nerva was broken, in which the best man was chosen, not the son, but the best man. Commodus was already feared by the Senate. He had no claim to the imperial power but the fact that he was the son of Marcus. And no sooner did he become emperor than his vicious ways were on display. It had been the goal of Marcus to conquer the Germans in the area, to annex them, to establish two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, to shore up the frontiers of the empire, and then to push ever deeper into Germany. Not for Commodus. No sooner was he emperor and his father out of the way than he made a peace treaty with the Germans, convincing them through his actions that Rome was not capable of conquering them, and then coming back to Rome to get into his gladiatorial life. And that is what he did, spending extraordinary amounts of time practicing to be a gladiator. And like Nero, as an opera singer, he got pretty good at it. He could kill dozens of ostriches, shoot them down as they ran across the arena with one arrow after another. Why, he was an excellent gladiator, fighting as a Samnite with his round shield and sword, fighting as the trident man with his three-pronged spear and net. And nobody ever had to throw a match. He won. And vicious, he fulfilled his goal of having this huge harem of 365 concubines. And vicious, loving pain and torture for their sake alone, loving to watch people tortured. Until finally, he turned even upon his own cronies and mistresses, having them strangled and murdered. Until finally, he was himself strangled in 192 AD He had made up another list of people to be killed, and finding themselves upon it, some of his closest associates got a gladiator to strangle him to death while he took a bath. And so, in darkness and disillusionment, ended the immense majesty of the golden age of the Roman Empire. It ended because Marcus Aurelius, noble as he was, did not have the will to make an enduring legacy of imperial power. Men and women make history. And had a Trajan set upon the throne, had a Julius Caesar set upon the throne in place of Marcus Aurelius, the empire would have endured century after century. But the problems of the Germans along the frontier and the unconquered Iranians would ultimately burst upon the scene in ever greater force in the 3rd century A.D. And to respond to this barbarian challenge, the empire would have to transform itself, raise taxes, make the bureaucracy ever larger, create an army that the larger and more expensive it became, the less efficient it would be, until ultimately it would be overwhelmed in the West by this barbarian flood. So Marcus Aurelius, if not a great Roman, is the last of our famous Romans. And as we did with our famous Greeks, let's step back a bit and see what we have learned. For as Plutarch told us, we study these lives in order to become better. Better as citizens, better as individuals. Who would be our favorites? Who would you pick from our list of famous Romans to model yourself upon, to call out that virtue which is in you? How about Scipio Africanus? Is he not a master general? Is he not an embodiment of civic virtue, who at the height of his power does not abuse his power, but steps back? Don't you wish there were politicians like that today, who would enter upon the scene, do what is good for their country, and do it with genius? He is one of the greatest generals in history. And then, rather than making their country go through terrible political trials, step back and pass on the baton to a new generation. But we will study not only winners, but losers. Hannibal is a loser, is he not? Yes, he's just like Napoleon. He lost. How else can you say it? He fought against Scipio and lost. Napoleon fought against the Duke of Wellington and lost, so he's a loser. He is a man who had only one focus, killing Romans. Vercingetorix is our better example of the noble loser. We ought to be drawn out to admiration for those who fight for a cause and go down to defeat, but nobly and honorably. And with Vercingetorix, having fought for the cause of freedom of his country, then goes out and surrenders his life, hoping that Caesar will spare the rest of his people. But Scipio Africanus the Younger, he conquered Carthage, did he not? Burned it to the ground, tried to solve political problems at Rome. But I would prefer his cousins, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. For they saw wrong and corruption, and they tried to right it. They died seeking what was good for their country. Crassus, Pompey, they are lessons to us to know your limits. Pompey was a good general. He should have stayed that, gone into retirement. Crassus could make money. He should have stayed that. Learn from that. Know your limits. Know what you're good at. And Caesar, why, he's like Alexander. He proves that there are individuals in history that know no boundaries to their greatness, that they are world historical figures. So who are we going to choose as our favorite? I might surprise you. I would take Cicero. Cicero lived in a world much like our own. Corrupt politics, money as the guiding star of most people. He became an attorney. He made money. And at the same time, he kept his honesty and his integrity. He set high sights for himself. He became consul. He wanted office, yes, for the nobility of being a consul, but also to do things for his country. And when the moment came, when he could have stayed in easy retirement, he stepped back into politics. Fighting a battle he knew he must lose, but it was the right thing. And he did his duty and met his death as he had gone through life with dignity and character. That would be the lesson of, I think, our most famous Roman and the most noble of them all.